The machine beeped twice, and the whole diner went quiet. "Sir, I'm sorry. Your card's been declined." Roderick Moretti didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. 3 blocks away, 4 men sat waiting in a black sedan for a single word from him. A word that could shut down half of Chicago before dinner. Men had knelt on wet concrete for less than the look he was giving that little plastic rectangle. But he wasn't reaching for his phone. Not today. Today he'd left the watch, the ring, and the name behind. And he'd walked into that corner diner on Taylor Street as nobody at all. He opened his wallet again. Empty. And then a small voice spoke behind him. "I'll pay for it." He turned around. The waitress stood there with a crumpled envelope held in both hands, 27 years old, shoes lined with cardboard, eyes looking anywhere but at his. She counted the bills onto the counter, one at a time. It was every dollar she'd earned that day, and she needed it more than he'd ever needed anything in his life. "You don't know who I am," he said. "I don't need to," she answered. Then she picked up her tray and walked into the kitchen before he could even thank her. Roderick stood alone in the middle of that diner, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't know what to do with his hands. People had feared him. People had begged him. Nobody had ever simply handed him something and walked away. He didn't know her name yet. He didn't know what that quiet, frightened girl had just cost herself. But he knew one thing: he had to find her again. If this story's got your attention already, go ahead and hit that like button. Share it with someone who still believes a small act of kindness can change a life. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning, to 6 hours earlier, and the morning that started all of this. The night before, in River Forest, the rain had stopped early and left the streets shining, and behind a shuttered restaurant on a quiet block, there was a storage warehouse that hadn't held anything worth stealing in 11 years. Roderick Moretti got there at 10:30. He didn't bring anyone in with him except Gio Ferraro, who stayed by the door with his hands folded in front of him, and Marcus Hale, who came in last and shut the door softly, the way a man closes a door in a house where somebody's sleeping. The capo was already there. He was a heavy-set man of about 50 who'd run the produce distribution routes on the west side for 9 years, and he'd been skimming off the top of them for 2. He stood up when Roderick came in. Nobody had told him to sit down in the first place. Roderick took off his coat and laid it across a stack of wooden pallets and rolled his sleeves once, and then he pulled a folding chair around and sat in it backward, forearms across the top rail, and looked up at the man like a doctor about to say something he'd already said to 100 other people. "Sit down, Aldo." Aldo sat. "Do you know why you're here?" "Rod, listen to me. That isn't what I asked you." Aldo's mouth worked for a second, and then he closed it. Roderick let the silence run. He'd learned a long time ago that silence did more damage than shouting, because a frightened man will fill it, and whatever he fills it with is usually the truth. Aldo filled it. He talked about his wife's surgery, and about a bad year, and about a nephew who'd made promises he couldn't keep. And Roderick listened to all of it without once looking away from his face, and when it was over, he nodded slowly, as though the explanation had been perfectly reasonable, which in a way it was. $240,000, Roderick said, over 26 months, in amounts small enough that you thought nobody would run the numbers sideways. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Gio brought over a leather folder and set it on the pallets and stepped back. Roderick didn't open it. The house in Elmwood Park goes back to the family. The 2 units on Grand Avenue go back. The boat goes. The account in your sister-in-law's name closes tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, and the balance moves before it does. Your name comes off the routes tonight. Aldo had gone the color of old paper. And me? You get a suitcase. Roderick stood up and put his coat back on, unhurried, the way a man leaves an office at the end of a long day. 1 suitcase. You pack it yourself. Gio drives you as far as the Indiana line, and after that you're a private citizen. You don't call anybody in this state. You don't come back for a funeral, not even your own mother's. If somebody in Chicago says your name to me 2 years from now, I want to be able to say I don't remember it. Rod, please, you're walking out of here on your own feet, Roderick said. Think about what that means, and then think about whether you want to say anything else to me tonight. Aldo didn't say anything else. Gio took him out the side door and the door closed, and then it was only the 2 of them in that big cold room with the light hanging down on its chain, and Marcus Hale finally moved off the wall. He was the only man alive who could stand in a room with Roderick and put his hands in his pockets. That was more mercy than he had coming. Marcus said. It was cheaper than the alternative. It was cheaper because you made it cheaper. Marcus came a few steps closer. Since we're already having a hard conversation, I want to put something in front of you. Roderick waited. The freight thing. The old route through the yards on the south end. Vitali's people have been asking for 8 months, and the number they're saying out loud now is $4 million a year. Clean off the top, and it costs us almost nothing to say yes. No, Rod. I said no. You didn't even think about it. I thought about it 8 months ago, and my answer hasn't changed and it isn't going to change. Roderick picked up the leather folder and tucked it under his arm. In 18 months, every dollar that comes into this family comes in through the front door of a business that pays taxes on it. The construction company, the linen contracts, the recovery firm. That's it. That's the whole plan, and there is no version of it where I let you back through a door I already welded shut. Marcus was quiet for a moment. And the men who don't want to be legitimate? Then they should start looking at Indiana, Roderick said, the same as Aldo. He walked toward the door and stopped with his hand on it. Tomorrow I'm not available. You know what day it is. I know what day it is, Marcus said. You always know. 1 day a year. Don't call me. Don't send anyone. Don't have anyone sitting on me. Geo parks and Geo stays parked. It's what we do every year. Marcus smiled, and it was a warm smile, and it reached his eyes. And there was nothing wrong with it that anyone in that room could have named. Go see your mother, Rod. Roderick nodded once and went out. And Marcus Hale stood there alone under the hanging light for a while afterward, still smiling faintly. Looking at the door, his boss had just walked through, the way a man looks at a clock he's been waiting all evening to watch strike the hour. He was awake at 5 o'clock without an alarm, the way he'd been awake at 5 o'clock on this same morning for 18 years, and he lay there in the dark for a while and didn't move. At 20 minutes past 5, he got up. He dressed in a plain gray shirt and a plain dark jacket. Nothing tailored, nothing that anybody in a room would notice or remember. And then he stood at the dresser and did the rest of it in the order he always did it. The watch came off first. He set it face down on the wood. The ring came off after that, his father's ring, the one he'd worn every day since he was 22 years old, and it left a pale band on his finger that never quite tanned over, and he laid it beside the watch and didn't look at it again. He took the piece out of the drawer, checked it out of pure habit, and put it back in the drawer, and closed the drawer. Then the phone. Not the personal one, the other one. The one that 400 people in 3 counties knew the number to. The one that had never in 11 years gone a full day without ringing. He powered it down and set it face down next to the watch and the ring, and the 3 of them sat there together on the dresser, like a man's belongings laid out on a table in a hospital. What went into his pockets was cash, and a single plain payment card from his personal account. Nothing else, no identification, no keys except the one to the front door. He counted it out on the dresser in the dark and folded it once, and put it in his inside pocket. And that was all he was carrying when he came down the stairs at 20 minutes to 6. Gio Ferraro was already in the kitchen with his coat on, and a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. 3 of the men were out in the driveway. Nobody was talking. They knew better than to talk on this morning, and they'd known better for years, and the silence in that house at 5:40 in the morning had a shape to it that all of them recognized without ever once having discussed it. Taylor Street, Roderick said. Yes, sir. You park 3 blocks off. All 4 of you stay in the car. You don't walk the block. You don't circle it. You don't sit in a window somewhere across the street where you think I won't see you. 3 blocks, and you stay in the car. Same as always. Same as always. Gio set the coffee down. He'd been driving Roderick for 6 years, and this was the only day of the year he ever asked a question. You want me to bring flowers out to the car for later? No, Roderick said. She never liked them cut. She used to say it was money spent on something that was already dying. And that was the whole of it, the only thing said out loud in that house about what day it was, and Gio nodded and picked up the keys and didn't say anything else. The black sedan let him out on the corner of Taylor Street a little before 6, with the sky still the color of wet slate. And it pulled away and turned and went 3 blocks down and parked. And it stayed there. Roderick walked. He hadn't walked a city block alone in daylight in more years than he could put a number to. And there was something almost physically strange about it. The ordinary weightlessness of being a man on a sidewalk that nobody was looking at. He passed a bakery pulling up its gate. He passed 2 women going to work. Nobody's eyes caught on him. Nobody straightened up. The pharmacy on the corner had its lights on, and its door propped open with a rubber wedge, and he was going past it, not into it, when he heard the voice inside. It was an old woman's voice, and it was apologizing. He stopped. Through the doorway, he could see her at the counter, 70-some years old, small, in a coat too light for the hour, counting out money onto the glass with both hands, and the pharmacist standing there with the white bag in his hand, and the sorry look on his face that people wear when they're about to say something they hate saying. "You're $47 short, Mrs. Delaney. I understand," she said. "I understand. I'll take half then. Can you do half? Or I'll come back Friday. It doesn't split that way." "Well," she said. "Well then, Friday." She reached to take the money back off the glass, and her hands weren't steady, and she was already gathering herself to be gracious about it, and Roderick was through the door before he decided to be. "Fill it." They both turned. He didn't look at her. He put the folded cash on the counter and moved $47 of it across the glass with 2 fingers. "Fill it. And put whatever else she's due for this month on top of it. And if she comes in here between now and Christmas, you carry it and I'll settle up. Do you understand me?" The pharmacist looked at the money and then at his face. "Yes. Yes, sir," the old woman said. "Young man, I can't let you." And Roderick took the rest of the cash, all of it, the entire fold, and pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers over it the way a man closes a door. "Take it. This is too much. This is far too—" "It isn't a favor," he said. "Don't make it one." And he turned and walked out of the pharmacy and into the gray morning without waiting for whatever she was going to say next. He'd made it 2 steps toward the door when her hand closed around his wrist. It was a small hand and there was almost no strength in it, and it stopped him the way nothing else in that city could have stopped him. "Wait," she said. "Wait, now. Turn around and let me look at you." He turned halfway. She was searching his face the way people search a face they've seen somewhere before. And then something moved behind her eyes and settled. "You're Carmela's boy," she said. "You're Carmela Moretti's." He pulled his wrist free. He did it gently. He wasn't rough with her, but he did it fast, the way a man pulls his hand back from something hot. And he was out the door and down the sidewalk before she got the rest of the sentence out. He didn't look back through the glass. He walked the 3 blocks with his hands empty and his pockets empty, and his heart going in a way it hadn't gone in a boardroom in 15 years. And the black sedan was where he'd told it to be, and Gio was out and holding the door open before he reached it. Roderick got in and sat for a moment and then said, "The woman in the pharmacy back there. Older, gray coat. Find out her name and where she lives." "Trouble?" "No, just find out." Gio wrote nothing down, because Gio never wrote anything down, and he pulled out into traffic and pointed the car west. The cemetery was in Hillside, 20 minutes out on the Eisenhower, and neither of them said a word the whole way. Mount Carmel on an April morning was almost empty. The big Italian mausoleums stood along the main drive with their doors and their carved names, the families who'd bought marble the way other people buy houses, and the car went past all of that and kept going, back to where the ground opened out, and the stones got low and plain and close together. Gio stopped at the end of the row and stayed with the car. Roderick walked in alone. Her marker was flat granite, set level with the grass, the kind you can mow straight over. Carmela Moretti. That was all it said. And the 2 dates. And nothing else. No verse, no angel, no line about beloved anything, because she'd left instructions about that with the funeral home in her own handwriting, and he'd been 19 years old and hadn't had the standing to argue with a piece of paper. He sat down on the grass beside it. He didn't kneel and he didn't cross himself, and he didn't say anything out loud. He just sat, the way a man sits down next to somebody on a bench, and the morning came up gray, and then a little brighter, and he stayed. He thought about the smell of her apron when she came in the door at night. That was always the first thing. Coffee and fryer grease and dish soap, and underneath it the cold of the outside air still in the wool of her coat, and she'd hang the coat on the hook and stand there a second with her hand on the wall, and that second was the only time she ever let him see how tired she was. He thought about the apartment on Aberdeen. 2 rooms. He thought about being 7 years old and understanding for the first time that they were leaving, that his mother had put their clothes in paper bags and they were going, and asking her why, and her saying only, "We're going," and never once in the rest of her life saying anything about his father to him that was cruel or that was true. He thought about the checks. They came the first week of every month for 11 years, in envelopes with no return address, and every one of them she signed on the back and mailed straight back to the address it came from, and she never opened them, and she never let him touch them, and she never explained it. He remembered being 12 and finding one on the table and looking at the number written on it and understanding that the number was more than she made in half a year and holding it and putting it back down. He thought about what it had felt like at 17 to walk out of that apartment and go to his father, and about what her face had done when he told her, which was nothing at all. She hadn't argued. She hadn't cried. She'd said, "You're old enough to choose," and she'd made him eat something before he went. And that was the last real conversation the two of them ever had that wasn't over a telephone. 2 years later, she was gone. The sun got high enough to be warm on the back of his neck. Somewhere off in another row, a mower started and ran for a while and quit. He sat there through all of it and never once put his hand on the stone, because there'd been 18 years of this and he'd never been able to do it, and this year wasn't going to be the year. Toward noon, he got up. He brushed the grass off and stood there a moment longer, looking down at the flat gray granite with her name on it and nothing else. Then he walked back up the row to the car, and Gio straightened, and Roderick said, "Take me back to Taylor Street. I'll get lunch at the old place." Gio didn't ask which old place. There was only ever one. That same morning, a little before 6 o'clock, Vivian Quinn sat on the edge of her bed and cut 2 ovals out of a cereal box with a paring knife and fit them down into her shoes. She'd been doing it since February. The left one wore through faster than the right, so she cut the left one a little thicker, and she pressed it flat with her thumb and put the shoe on and stood up and tested her weight on it, and it held, and she turned off the light and went out. The walk to work was 11 minutes. She did it before the buses got heavy. In that hour when the city belongs to people who clean things and open things and unlock things for everybody else, and she had the envelope in her coat pocket, and she was counting it in her head the whole way, which was a habit she couldn't break, even though she already knew the number. She'd counted it at the kitchen table the night before, then she'd put it away, and then she'd taken it out and counted it again, because there was always the chance that she'd made a mistake in her own favor and hadn't noticed. She hadn't. On Taylor Street, waiting for the light across from the pharmacy, she saw the end of something. A man came out through the propped door with nothing in his hands. Behind him in the doorway, an old woman had both her own hands closed around a fold of money, holding it up a little, saying something after him. He didn't stop. He didn't slow down or turn his head or lift a hand, and whatever the woman was calling out to him, he walked straight through it the way a man walks through weather. And then the light changed, and he went off down the block, with his hands in his empty pockets. Vivian stood there for a second longer than she needed to. She'd seen people give money away before. She'd seen it done loudly. What she hadn't ever seen was a man do it and then leave that fast, as though being thanked was the part he couldn't sit still for. And she thought, walking on, that she'd only ever known one kind of person who moved like that, somebody who wasn't used to anybody being glad to see him, somebody who didn't have anywhere in particular to be at 6 in the morning and wasn't going home either. She let herself in through the back of the Bluebird at 20 past 6 and tied on her apron and started the coffee. Dominic Rossi was already in the kitchen and already complaining about the produce man, and she said good morning, and he said good morning, and the day went the way the days went. She was 27 years old, and she'd been on that floor for 4 years. Her father had been an ironworker out of Local 63 for 31 years, and on a job on the near west side, he'd gone off the scaffolding, and the men who were there said afterward that it wasn't anybody's mistake. It was just a morning. The fall did his head and it did his spine. He'd been at the care facility in Cicero ever since, and he knew her, most days, and on the days he didn't, she stayed the same length of time anyway. The hospital bill was $41,000. She had made payments on it for a year and a half. Small ones, faithfully, and it hadn't mattered. And then the hospital sold the debt to a collection company she'd never heard of, and the collection company took her to court in Cook County and won. Illinois lets a creditor take 15% of your gross pay, and they take it before you ever see it, and there's nothing to sign and nobody to talk to. It comes off the top of the check and the rest is what you live on. Her check was what covered the room in Cicero, or what used to, because Medicare had stopped covering him a long time ago, and the private share was $2,900 a month. She was $11,600 behind. She knew the number the way she knew her own birthday. The one thing the court order couldn't reach was cash tips. It didn't run through payroll and it didn't show up on any statement, so whatever went into the pocket of her apron between 6 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon was the only money in her life that was actually hers, and every dollar of it went into the envelope, and the envelope went to Cicero. At 20 of 10, her phone buzzed against her hip. She took it out with one hand while she was carrying a pot in the other, and looked at the screen, and it was the billing office. She let it go. It buzzed a second time 40 minutes later, and she let that go too. And she went and wiped down the counter that didn't need wiping down, and she stood there with the rag in her hand for a moment, and made herself breathe. She would call them back tomorrow. She told herself that every day, and every day it was true, and every day tomorrow moved. The lunch rush started at 11. She worked it. She was quick, and she was quiet, and she apologized to people who had nothing to be sorry about. And a little after 12, the bell over the door went, and a man came in alone, and took the corner booth by the window, table 6, and she looked up and knew his face before she knew where she knew it from. It came to her while she was filling his water glass. The pharmacy. The empty hands. She set the glass down and stepped back and got out her pad, and he was already looking at the menu without really reading it, the way people do when they've known what they're ordering since before they came through the door. "The meatball sandwich?" he said, "and a cup of the minestrone. The soup comes in a bowl now. It's been a bowl for a few years. Then a bowl." He handed her the menu without looking up at her, and she took it, and she noticed the pale band on his finger where a ring had been and wasn't. She put the order in. Dominic was on the flat top, and she said, "Table 6 wants the meatball and the minestrone." And Dominic said, "In that case, table 6 has good sense," and she went back out to the floor and worked her other tables and didn't look over at the window booth again for a while, but she saw him without looking. He ate slowly. He wasn't reading anything. He didn't have a phone out on the table the way every other man in that place had a phone out on the table, and once she came back around with the pot, and he had both hands around the coffee cup, and was watching the street go by outside, and he'd stopped chewing, and he was just sitting there with the sandwich half gone in front of him like a man who'd forgotten which decade he was in. She refilled the cup, and he said thank you, quietly, and it startled her a little, because most people don't. At 1:45, he came up to the register to settle. She rang it in and told him the number, and that was when he opened his wallet on the counter, and something slid out of it. It came out from behind the cards and dropped flat on the laminate between them, and she looked down at it, and it was a name tag, not a new one. A plastic bluebird name tag from before Dominic changed the aprons, the old style, cream-colored with the blue script logo across the top, and the letters punched into it one at a time on a machine that had been thrown out years ago. It said, Carmela. There was a hairline crack running up through the pin back where somebody had dropped it once and kept using it anyway, and the corner was worn round and soft, the way plastic goes when it's been carried in a pocket for a very long time. She knew that name tag. She'd walked past that woman's photograph 400 times, up on the wall by the register with the other old staff pictures, a dark-haired woman, with her hair pinned back, standing behind that same counter in 1990-something, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. He picked the tag up off the laminate before Vivian could say anything about it, and put it back in the wallet, carefully, behind the cards where it went, and his face didn't change at all while he did it. And then the rest of it happened, and she stood there for 3 seconds with her hand already in her apron pocket. 3 seconds, and no longer. And then she did what she did. Afterward, she went into the kitchen and set the tray down on the steel and didn't turn around right away. Dominic had been standing in the past the whole time. "Vivian, I know. $11.40. I know what it was. That's not the point I'm making, and you know it isn't." He came around and put the spatula down. He was 60 years old, and he'd known her since she was 23, and he had that look he got when he was angry at the wrong thing on purpose, because the right thing was too big to be angry at. You've got a man in a nice jacket, on his own 2 feet, no wedding ring, walks in here and can't cover a sandwich. That's not a hard luck story. That's a story with a piece missing out of it. Maybe, and it comes out of your pocket, not his. It's mine to come out of. "That's what I'm saying to you," Dominic said. "That's exactly what I'm saying to you." He went back to the flat top and didn't say anything more about it, which was worse. She stood there a second, and then went out through the alley door and sat down on the stack of milk crates by the wall where the girls went to be tired for 4 minutes at a time, and she took the envelope out of her apron and opened it and looked at it. There was a little over $9 left in it. She'd earned 20 and change since 6 o'clock that morning, and it was a Tuesday, and Tuesdays never came back. Then she took out the other thing that was in the pocket, the folded paper from the billing office in Cicero, the one with the account number on top and the balance in the box on the right, the one she'd been carrying around for 9 days and reading at red lights. She unfolded it, She read the number again the way you press on a bruise, and then she tore it in half, and in half again, and again, until it was small, and she held the pieces in her fist for a moment and then dropped them in the barrel by the door. It didn't change anything. She wasn't pretending it did. It was just that she'd been carrying it since the 9th, and she'd decided she wasn't going to carry it into the afternoon. He walked the 3 blocks back, and got into the car, and sat there for a moment without saying anything. And Gio watched him in the mirror, and knew that something had gone wrong somewhere in the last hour, and knew better than to ask what. "Turn the phone on," Roderick said. "Sir?" "The other phone. Turn it on and call the bank." It took 11 minutes. Gio made the first call from the driver's seat with the car still at the curb, and then he made a second one, and then he got out and stood on the sidewalk with his back to the window for the third, and when he got back in, he didn't start the engine right away. "It's not the card. Say it plainly." "It's 4 accounts," Gio said. "The operating account, the 2 under the construction company, and the personal one. All 4 went to a hold at 6 o'clock this morning. Not a decline, not a fraud flag. A hold. Somebody called it in. Somebody. Somebody with the authorization codes, and the answers to the security questions and the tax identification numbers off the top of his head. The bank has it logged as an internal compliance request." Gio's hands were on the wheel, and they hadn't moved. "It came from inside the house, sir." Roderick looked out the window at Taylor Street. 6 o'clock in the morning. Not 7, not 9, not after the markets opened. 6, which was 20 minutes after he'd walked out of his own kitchen and left a phone face down on a dresser. On the one day out of 365 that everybody who mattered knew he'd be unreachable and unwilling to be reached. It had been done with a calendar, not with a grudge. Somebody had wanted to see what happened to the machinery when the man at the top of it couldn't be called. "Get it released," he said. "Tomorrow morning, not tonight." "You don't want it moved tonight? I want whoever did it to have a comfortable evening." Then he said, "Before we go, walk back down there. The diner on the corner. There was a girl on the floor who covered my check. Find out what I owe her and leave 300 with the owner." Gio was gone about 10 minutes. When he came back, he leaned in at the window first before he got in. "She's not there. Shift ended at 2. She's got a second job somewhere downtown. The owner said she does 5 nights. He wouldn't take the money. He wouldn't take it. He said if she wanted to give it away, it was hers to give away, and it wasn't his business to sell it back." Gio almost smiled and then didn't. "I got her name off him, though. Vivian Quinn. Write it down. Sir, write it down and hold it. I'll deal with it in a few days." So Gio wrote it down. The one time in 6 years he wrote anything down, in the small book that went back into his inside pocket, and that later that evening got typed into the log, the way everything got typed into the log, a name, and a place of employment, and a reason, and that reason was recorded as personal, at the boss's direction, and it sat there in the system where anybody with the right password could find it. They drove to the office in Elmwood Park. Marcus Hale was already in the outer room with his coat off and a folder under his arm, and he stood up the moment the door opened, and his face had exactly the right amount of concern on it. "I've been trying you since 11, he said. "I know it's today. I didn't send anyone. You called the office instead." "I called the office instead. Rod, I've got it handled. It's an ugly little mess, and it's already handled." He opened the folder on the desk and turned it around. The bank flagged the outbound wires from last quarter against the new reporting thresholds. Their compliance desk put a hold on the linked accounts at open of business and didn't call anybody because the primary contact number on file is the office line, and the office line doesn't pick up before 8. Roderick sat down. He looked at the top page for a while. "Who did you speak to?" "Their vice president. Twice. He's mortified. It'll clear by 10 tomorrow. "That's fine. That's it? That's all you're going to say?" "You said it's handled." Roderick closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. "It's handled." And Marcus looked at him for a second and then laughed a little, relieved, the way a man laughs when the storm he'd braced for went around the house, and he picked up his coat and said something about dinner and about how the produce routes were already covered for the morning, and Roderick nodded and said goodnight, and watched him go out through the door, and heard his footsteps go down the hall, and heard the outer door close. He sat there another minute. Then he said, quietly, without raising his voice at all, "Gio." Gio came in from the hall. "Sir, pull the bank's access log. Every login on all 4 accounts going back 90 days, and I want the internet addresses, not just the names." "Tonight?" "Tonight. And don't run it through the office. Gio hesitated. One beat. Sir, the only people with those credentials are you, the accountant, and Marcus. I know, Roderick said. That's why I want the log. She clocked in downtown at 6 that evening and took the service car up with the rest of the crew. 4 women and a man, all of them tired in that particular way. People are tired at the start of a shift instead of the end of one. Their floors were 30 through 42. They worked it the same way every night, 2 of them on the wet side and 2 on the dry side and the 5th running the barrels. And nobody said much, because there's a kind of work that doesn't want conversation in it. At a little after 9, she took her 15 minutes in the stairwell on 36 and called Cicero. The billing office had an after-hours line, and a woman who answered it and read from a screen. Vivian said her father's name and gave the account number from memory. She said she was sorry to be calling so late. She said she understood the balance, and she wasn't disputing it, and she wasn't asking anybody to forgive it. She was asking for 60 days, and she would sign whatever they wanted her to sign. She said the reason it had gotten behind was a wage order, and the wage order took 15% off the top, and there wasn't a way to make that stop. And she was sorry. She knew that wasn't the office's problem. The woman said she was very sorry too. She said the file had already been reviewed at the end of March, and the extension granted then, and that a second extension on a private pay balance of that size wasn't something she had the authority to enter. Vivian said she understood. She said thank you for your time, and she said she was sorry again. 3 times in 11 minutes she said it, and she was the one being pushed. And she said it anyway, because that's what you do when you're asking. Then she hung up and sat on the concrete step for a minute with the phone in both hands. And then she stood up and went back out to the barrel and finished 36. At 10:15, the supervisor came through and said they were pulling 3 people up to 44. Nobody went to 44. 44 was the executive floor of a company whose name was on the lobby directory and whose offices had their own cleaning arrangement. And in 4 months, Vivian had never once been sent up there. The supervisor said the arrangement had changed, and the floor needed a wet pass on the main corridor before midnight, and it needed to be done quietly. So she went up with 2 others, and they split. And she took the long corridor that ran from the elevator bank down past the glass conference rooms toward the corner office. And she had the mop and the yellow barrel, and she was 3/4 of the way down it when the elevator opened behind her. She heard it. She turned around the way you turn around at any sound in an empty building at 11 o'clock at night. 5 men came out. 4 of them she didn't know, and they moved the way men move when they've been told where to stand, spreading out without being told again, one staying at the elevator, and the 5th one came out last and unhurried, and it was him. The gray jacket was gone. The whole man was different, not the face. The face was the same face that had been sitting in the window at table 6 with both hands around a coffee cup. But everything the face was doing had changed, and the way he walked down that corridor a person would have believed he owned the building, and he did not look like a man who had ever in his life stood at a register and been told no. He saw her. It was maybe 8 feet, and he looked directly at her and she looked directly back, and neither of them said one word. His expression didn't move. Then he went past her and through the door of the corner office, and one of the men closed it behind him, and it didn't latch all the way. She should have turned the barrel around and gone back to the elevator. She stood where she was. There was a man already in that office. She could hear him talking before the door even shut, fast and loud, a big voice that filled the room, saying something about how nobody had told him, how he'd been carrying this thing for 2 years and he'd carried it clean, and there was a sound of a chair. And then Roderick Moretti spoke, and she couldn't hear the words the first time because he said them so quietly, and she realized that was the point, that the whole room had to get quiet in order to hear him, and the room did. Sit down. A pause. You told me the Halstead parcel was in your wife's name. It's in your brother's. That's the only thing you said tonight that I'm going to remember. Another pause, longer, and the big voice starting up again, in a different register, pleading now, and then cut off. Everything you have because of a signature of mine. Go home and think about which of those things you'd like to keep. That was all. 3 sentences, and the man in that office made a sound she would hear again in her sleep. And Vivian stood in the corridor with both hands on the handle of a mop and understood, completely and all at once, exactly who had sat in her section that afternoon with an empty wallet and let her pay for his lunch. She took the barrel and the mop down the back hall to the freight elevator, because that was where the barrels went, and because her hands needed something to do that they already knew how to do. The freight car was slow. She had the gate half down when a hand came under it and stopped it, and she looked up and it was him, alone, no coat, no men. He pushed the gate back up and stepped in and let it come down behind him. The car started moving. He didn't press anything. "You didn't run," he said. "No. Why not?" She looked at the numbers going down over the door. "Because I've been on my feet since 6 o'clock this morning and I wasn't going to get very far." He didn't laugh, but something in his face moved a little. "Why did you pay for my lunch? Does it matter?" "I've thought about it all afternoon," he said, "and I can't get an answer that sounds right, and that doesn't happen to me often." So she told him. She said she'd been standing at the light across from the pharmacy at 6 that morning waiting to cross, and she'd seen the end of it. A man walking out with nothing in his hands, and an old woman in the doorway calling after him, and he hadn't turned around. "You didn't even slow down," she said. "I thought about that all day too. I've never seen anybody do a thing like that and not want the thanks for it. That isn't a reason to spend your own money." "No," she agreed. "That part was the name tag." He went very still. "When you opened your wallet, it came out. It landed on the counter face up." She said it carefully, because she could feel that she was walking on something thin. Carmela Moretti. She worked at the Bluebird. Her picture's on the wall by the register, in with the old staff photographs. She's behind that same counter and she's laughing at somebody. I've walked past it every day for 4 years. The floor numbers kept going down, and neither of them looked at them. I've never asked Dominic who she was, but I know what it means when a man carries something like that in his wallet. Roderick didn't answer. He stood in that freight car with his hands at his sides, and for a long moment, he was not the man who had walked down the corridor on 44, and Vivian saw it, and had the sense not to say another word about it. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. "What's your name?" "Vivian Quinn." "Roderick." "I know," she said. "Everybody up there said it about 4 times. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I imagine they did." The car came to the loading level and stopped, and neither of them moved to open the gate. "I want to make it right," he said. $11. Not the $11. He said it evenly. 10,000. Tonight, in cash, and nobody would ever know where it came from, and you'd never see me again if that's what you wanted. She didn't say anything. "Or something better. I'm told there's a wage garnishment against you, and a private pay balance in Cicero. I can have all of it gone by the end of business tomorrow. The judgment vacated, the order lifted, the account paid to 0. It would cost me less than dinner." And Vivienne stood there and thought about $11,600, and about the cereal box in her shoes, and about a woman on a screen in an after-hours office reading her a sentence about authority, and she felt the whole weight of it come down on her at once, and she understood, with a clarity that frightened her a little, that she was going to say no. "No, you haven't thought about it. I've thought about nothing else since the phone call in the stairwell tonight," she said. "That's how I know." He started to say something, and she went on. "I bought you lunch. I'm not selling it back to you." He raised his hand. She saw him do it, saw the hand come up a few inches between them with nothing in it. A gesture from a man who had spent 20 years never once needing to persuade anybody of anything, and then she watched him understand that there was nothing at the end of the gesture, and he let it drop. He looked at the floor of the freight car. "Nobody talks to me like that," he said at last, and it wasn't a threat. It came out of him almost helplessly. "Somebody did once," Vivian said. "That's the whole reason I'm not taking your money." He lifted his head. And whatever he'd been about to say to that, he didn't say it. She pulled the gate up and pushed the barrel out onto the dock, and the wheels went loud over the seam in the concrete, and she was 6 or 7 steps out before she looked back. He was still standing inside the car with the gate open and his hands at his sides. "Mr. Moretti." "Roderick." "The soup's better on Thursdays," she said. "That's when he makes it." And she went on with the barrel, and the freight elevator sat there on the loading level with the gate up for a long while afterward, because the man inside it hadn't yet remembered to press anything. 4 days later, Marcus Hale came into the office in Elmwood Park with a thin folder and set it down on the desk without being asked to. "What's this?" "Quinn. Vivienne Marie. 27. 4 years at the Bluebird. 5 nights a week on a cleaning crew downtown. Apartment on Lexington. No record. No husband. No brothers." Marcus sat down across from him and crossed one leg over the other. "Father's at a care facility in Cicero. Catastrophic fall. Been there going on 3 years. There's a judgment against her out of Cook County and a wage order running on it. Roderick didn't touch the folder. Where did you get her name? Off the log. Gio ran an entry on her the same afternoon your accounts went sideways. Marcus said it lightly, pleasantly, the way you mentioned the weather, which is why I looked. When your driver starts writing down waitresses on the day somebody freezes 4 of your accounts, I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't look. You'd be doing me a disservice. Rod. Marcus leaned forward a little. For 20 years nobody has seen you. Not the Tribune, not a grand jury, not one photograph anybody could put a date on. You've been a rumor with a construction company attached to it, and that's the whole reason you're still sitting in that chair. He tapped the folder once with 2 fingers. And now there's a girl in a diner on Taylor Street who's seen you with your wallet open. Roderick sat back. Say the rest of it. There isn't any rest of it. That's the whole thought. Then let me finish it for you. His voice hadn't changed at all, and that was the thing about it. It never changed, and men who'd known him a long time had learned that the flatness was the warning. You'll stay away from her. You won't drive down that street. You won't have anybody sit on that block. You won't call that owner. You won't have her name typed into anything else that's ever printed in this office. If she trips on a curb in the next 12 months, I'm going to come and ask you about it. Do you understand me? There was a beat, half a second, no more. Then Marcus smiled. It was the same warm smile it always was. The one that reached his eyes and had nothing in it that anybody could have pointed to and named. Of course, he said. She's nobody. I only brought it because it's my job to bring it. He stood and picked up his coat. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't. Well, Marcus said from the doorway. It's that time of year. And he went out, and his footsteps went down the hall the same way they always did. Roderick sat there until the outer door closed. Then he said, Gio. Gio came in. Sir. The Quinn judgment. Find out who holds the paper on it, and buy it. Quietly, through somebody with no connection to this office. And then vacate the order and pay the balance in Cicero to 0 and close the file. She's not to know. Not from you, not from the facility, not from a letter with a name on it. How much do you want spent? Whatever it costs. And Gio, he looked up. Nothing about it goes in the log. That was on a Thursday. On Friday morning, at 10 minutes to 6, Vivian came around the corner onto Taylor Street, and a woman was standing in front of the Bluebird with 2 coffees. She was somewhere in her 40s, in a plain coat, and she held one of the cups out and said, Miss Quinn, my name is Helen Whitmore. I'm with the Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I'd like 9 minutes. Vivian didn't take the coffee. Whitmore set both cups on the ledge of the window and took out a photograph instead. And it was Roderick, taken through a windshield somewhere, 3/4 and slightly blurred. Do you know this man? He ate in my section. His name is Roderick Moretti. He's been the head of what's left of the outfit on this side of the city for over a decade. And I've had a racketeering file open on him for 2 years, and I've got almost nothing in it, because he doesn't use phones, and he doesn't sit down with people he hasn't known for a decade. She put the photograph away. But he sat down in your dining room and let you pay for his lunch. How would you know that? It's a small city. Whitmore let a moment go by. Miss Quinn, I've watched that man for 2 years, and there's exactly 1 day a year I can tell you where he'll be. He takes off the watch. He takes off the ring. He leaves the phone in the house, and he sends the car 3 blocks off, and he walks. And he does it on the same date every April, and I have never once been able to get anybody near him on it. Vivian looked at her. He talked to you, Whitmore said. That's more than I've had in 2 years. I'm asking you to wear a recorder. No, take a week. I don't need a week. Vivian picked up her keys. That man paid an old woman's pharmacy bill and walked out before she could thank him. I don't know what else he is, but I'm not going to be the one who does that to somebody. And she went inside and tied on her apron. And out on the sidewalk, Helen Whitmore stood there with 2 cooling cups of coffee and let her go. Gio moved on it that same Friday, quietly, through a lawyer in Berwyn who'd never had a Moretti file on his desk in his life, and the inquiry went out asking who held the Quinn judgment and what it would take to buy the paper. It was a small, clean, careful question. It went into a system, and it had a name attached to it. And by Monday afternoon, Marcus Hale knew every word of it. He didn't stop it. He simply got there first. On Tuesday morning, Dominic Rossi asked her to come into the back before she'd even finished the coffee urns. He'd been up all night. She could see it. And he had a letter in his hand. and he kept turning it over as though the back of it might say something different than the front. "Vivian, sit down a minute." "I'll stand." "Sit down." She sat on the crate. "The building sold," he said. "Not the block. Just this one. Somebody bought the building out from under Mr. Cavallo on Friday, and the new landlord sent that." He put the letter on the prep table. "My lease has got a clause in it about staffing levels that's been in there since 1991, and nobody in 30 years has ever once looked at it. They looked at it. As of the first of the month, I'm capped at 4 on the floor, and I've got 6. Dom. I've got 2 with more time in than you, and I've got a man with 3 kids, and I've got Angela, who's been here since my wife was alive." He wasn't looking at her. In 4 years, she'd never seen him not look at somebody. "It isn't performance. I want that said out loud in this room. It isn't performance, and it isn't the $11, and it isn't anything you did. Then tell them no. I've got 14 months left on the lease, and if I say no, I'm out in 90 days, and then it's all 6 of you instead of 2. He put both hands flat on the table. "I don't know who bought this building," I asked. "Nobody would tell me. She worked the shift. She worked all of it, the whole rush. And she was steady the entire time, and she thanked people who tipped her, and she thanked people who didn't, and at 2 o'clock she untied the apron and folded it, and left it on the crate where she'd been sitting that morning. On Wednesday, the cleaning contractor called her at 4 in the afternoon, an hour before she was due downtown. The building had gone out to a new vendor. It happened all the time in that business, and it had happened this time on a Wednesday with no notice. And the woman on the phone was reading from a script and told her she was welcome to apply to the incoming company, and that there was no guarantee about the shift or the rate. Vivian said thank you. She hung up and sat on the edge of her bed with the phone in her hand, and then she got up and pulled the 2 cereal box ovals out of her shoes, because the shoes weren't going anywhere that night, and she put them on the table and looked at them. 2 jobs in 2 days. She was not a stupid woman. But there was nothing in either of those days that a person could point at. A landlord had bought a building. A contractor had changed vendors. Both of those things happen in Chicago 400 times a year, and both of them come with paperwork and signatures and a return address. And there was not one single thing in any of it she could take to anybody, because nobody had broken a law. That was the part that sat in her chest. Nobody had even been rude to her. On Thursday, the letter from Cicero came. It came in a windowed envelope with the facility's name in the corner, and she stood in the entryway of her building and opened it standing up. And it was 2 pages. The first page was a statement of the account, $11,682, past due. The second page was headed Notice of Involuntary Discharge, and it said that Thomas Quinn would be transferred out of the facility in 30 days for non-payment, and it listed the date, and it said she had the right to appeal to the state, and it gave her the address to write to, and it was signed by the administrator in blue ink over her printed name. 30 days. She read the whole thing twice, standing in the entryway with the mailbox door still hanging open, and she understood every word of it, and the worst part, the part she couldn't get past, was that every word of it was legal. There'd been a review. There'd been a letter in March. There'd been a hearing she was entitled to, and a right of appeal spelled out in a paragraph, and somewhere in a state office there was a regulation with a number on it that made all of this correct and orderly and impossible to be angry at. Her eyes went, and she let them for a moment. One moment, standing there in a cold vestibule with her coat still buttoned. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and folded the letter along its own creases and put it in her pocket, and she stood there a while longer thinking. On Friday night, she walked to Taylor Street at 9:30, after the Bluebird had turned its sign, and looked in through the glass. The sign was off, and the chairs were up on the tables, and there was one light burning over the counter. And in the corner booth by the window, alone, at table 6, sat Roderick Moretti. Dominic let her in, and then went into the back and stayed there. She didn't sit down. She stood at the end of the booth with her coat still buttoned, and she took the letter out of her pocket and put it on the table in front of him. And then she said it plainly, the way she'd practiced it the whole 11 minutes of the walk. "Did you do this?" He read the first page. He turned it over and read the second one, and then he looked up. "No. Somebody bought the building I worked in. Somebody canceled a cleaning contract that had 11 months left on it. And now they're moving my father out in 30 days, and all of it happened in 3 days, and it started the week after you sat in my section. I understand how it looks. Then say it again." "No," he said. "I didn't do this. I gave one order about you, and the order was to fix that judgment and pay that balance. and never let you find out I'd done it, and I gave it 4 days ago." He set the letter down. Somebody heard the order and got in front of it and did the opposite, and did it in a way that leaves paper with other people's names on it. "Who? That's not your question to carry. It's my father. I know whose it is." She looked at him for a long moment. He hadn't looked away once, and he hadn't offered her anything yet, and she noticed that, and it mattered more than anything he could have said. "All right," she said. "I believe you. You shouldn't. I know I shouldn't." She sat down then, across from him. "Fix it." "I intend to. Then I want to say the other part before you start." She put her hands flat on the table. "The last time we talked, you offered me $10,000 and I told you no, and I'd tell you no again tonight, and I want you to understand it's not pride. If somebody hands me $11,000, then in 5 weeks I'm right back here, and I've got nothing, and I've spent somebody else's money, and I still can't hold the room. That's not help. That's a nice month." "Then what do you want?" "A job," Vivian said. "That's it. That's the whole thing I came here to ask for. I've got no diner and no crew, and I'm not going to find 2 jobs by Friday. Give me work, real hours, a real wage that I earn every single hour of, and I'll take care of the rest of it myself." He sat back. It took him a while to answer. "I've got a house in River Forest," he said finally. "There's a woman who's run it for 19 years, and she's leaving in June to go to her daughter in Arizona, and I've been putting off doing anything about it. It's a real position. 7 to 4, 5 days, and the pay is more than you made at both places put together, and I'm telling you that up front so you can decide whether that number makes it charity." Vivian thought about it. "Is it what you'd pay somebody else?" "It's what I've paid her for 19 years. "Then it isn't charity." She held out her hand across the table and he looked at it. "One thing. I want it in writing. You want a contract. Duties, hours, rate, notice on both sides, and who I answer to." She kept her hand out, "so that if this ever goes wrong, I've got a piece of paper too. Everybody in my life these last 3 days has had a piece of paper except me." He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to it she'd seen on him. "Get a pen from Dominic," he said. He wrote it out on the back of a bluebird order pad, 4 lines and a rate and a start date, and he signed it, and she read every word before she signed under it, and she folded her half and put it in the same pocket the discharge notice had come out of. She started that Monday. The house was big and quiet, and she didn't spend 1 minute of that first week looking at any of it, because there was a linen inventory 2 years out of date, and a pantry that hadn't been pulled and washed since the fall, and she went at it the way she'd gone at everything since she was 19 years old. He didn't perform for her. That was the thing she noticed, and kept noticing over those first weeks. He got up before she arrived, and he was in the study with the door open by 7, and men came and went, and none of them ever spoke to her. And at some point in the afternoon, he'd stand at the window in the back hall with a cup of coffee and not drink it. Once she came through with an armload of linens, and he was standing there, and he said, without turning around, "There's a woman on Taylor Street named Ruth Delaney. If you ever need anything and I'm not somewhere you can reach me, she'll know how to find me." Vivian said all right, and kept walking, and neither of them mentioned it again. The wage order still came off the top of every check. She'd expected that. She'd checked the first stub in the kitchen with her coat still on, and seen the 15% gone, and put it in her bag and gone back to work. It was a Thursday in the 5th week, and the task was boxing. The lawyers were coming Monday to take 4 years of corporate files out of the study, and Roderick had asked her to crate them in order, folder by folder, so nothing got shuffled, and she'd said she would do it after lunch. She wasn't reading them. That has to be said, because it was true, and because it was the reason she never had a moment to prepare herself. She had a stack in her left hand, and she was laying them into the crate spine up, and the folders were the kind with the flap that doesn't quite close, and the top sheet of the one she was setting down had slid up about an inch out of the fold. That was all. 1 inch of paper, and it was a letterhead. She had seen that letterhead more times than she could count. A pale gray band across the top, and the name in that particular narrow typeface with the word Partners set slightly apart from the rest, and a loop address, and a telephone number she had dialed on 11 separate occasions, and been put on hold on 9 of them. Lakeshore Recovery Partners. She had it at home in a shoebox, 14 letters over 8 months. The first one saying that the account had been assigned to them, the last one saying that judgment had been entered, and that an order for withholding had been served on her employer. She had read those letters at her kitchen table and at red lights, and once in the parking lot in Cicero. And here it was, in a folder, in a study in River Forest, in the stack she was packing for his lawyers. She stood there holding it. Then she took the folder out of the crate and pulled the whole file, and it was not a letter to him. It was a holding summary, with his construction company's name at the top of the page and a list under it, and the fourth line of that list was Lakeshore Recovery Partners, and beside it the words wholly owned. She went and found him in the back hall by the window, with the coffee he wasn't drinking. "What is Lakeshore Recovery Partners?" He turned around. She watched it land on him. She watched him understand the question before he answered it, and she watched him decide not to reach for anything. And that was the moment she stopped hoping. "It's a debt buyer," he said. "We hold it under the construction company. You own it." "Yes." "Say the rest." "It buys consumer paper. Medical, mostly. Hospital systems sell off what they can't collect, and we buy it at a discount, and we work it." He didn't look away from her. "It's been operating for 6 years. It's legal. It's licensed with the state. It files everything it's supposed to file. And it's one of the things I've been using to move this family onto the right side of a line. It bought my father." He didn't say anything. "Say it out loud." "I didn't know." "That is not what I asked you." He was quiet. "You didn't sign the summons," she said. "I understand that. Nobody at that company knows my name, and I don't think any human being ever looked at my file for longer than 4 seconds. And that's not the part. The part is that you built it." She was not shouting. Her voice was perfectly level, and it was the worst sound in that house. "Somebody in an office you own decided that a man who fell off a scaffold was worth 11 cents on the dollar, and somebody you pay went to the Daily Center and got an order that takes 15% off the top of my check before I ever see it. And that order is still running. It ran last Friday. It came out of the money you pay me. Nothing. I stood in a vestibule 3 weeks ago with a letter that said they were putting my father out in 30 days, and I couldn't be angry at anybody, because every single person in the chain had done their job correctly, and there was a regulation number at the bottom of the page." She held up the file. "This is who was at the other end of it. This whole time. 8 months of envelopes, and it was you." He set the coffee cup down on the sill. He still hadn't said one word in his own defense, and she understood, watching him, that he wasn't going to, and that his silence was not a tactic. It was the only honest thing available to him. "You paid for an old woman's heart medicine one morning in April," she said, "and you walked out before she could thank you. And I gave you every dollar I had that day because of it. I would do it again. That's what makes me sick." Her hands were steady. "One morning a year you're the man in the pharmacy, and the other 364 days a year, you own the nightmare. You own the letters. You own the phone number I called 11 times. You own the part of my life I can't get out from under. And you own it in a filing cabinet where you never even have to look at it. Vivienne, don't." He stopped. She put the file down on the sill next to the cup, squared it, because her hands did that on their own. Then she untied the apron and folded it and set it on the file. And she took her coat off the hook by the back door and put it on and buttoned it. He didn't move from the window. He didn't follow her down the hall, and he didn't say her name again, and he didn't call anybody, and no car pulled out after her. He simply stood there, and she opened the door and went out, and she didn't say anything else at all. He didn't send anybody after her, and he didn't have her followed, and he didn't call the house on Lexington. And on Monday morning, instead of handing 4 years of files to his lawyers, he told them to wait, and he asked for something else. He asked for the portfolio, not the summary, not the quarterly, the whole book. Every account Lakeshore Recovery Partners had bought since the day he'd put his signature on its articles of incorporation 6 years earlier, printed out, brought to the house in boxes. It took them 2 days to get it to him, and it filled the study floor. 60,000 files. That was the number. 60,000 people in the state of Illinois with a hospital bill behind them, and he sat on the floor of his own study in his shirt sleeves and opened them at random, the way a man deals cards. A woman in Rockford, gallbladder, 4,000 and change. A man in Danville who'd had a heart attack in a parking lot and lived. A retired school teacher in Peoria. Ambulance charges, the same ambulance company over and over, $640 a ride. Emergency room visits from people who had insurance and still owed $9,000 afterward, and never understood why. He read the notes fields, which was the part nobody was ever meant to read. The notes fields had the phone calls in them, abbreviated, 1 line each. Refused to provide employer. Says husband deceased. Says will pay when able. Hung up. Crying. Disconnected. He'd never once opened one of these. He'd built the company and capitalized it, and hired the man who hired the men, and he'd looked at the return, which was excellent, and the paper had been bought at a few cents on the dollar and collected on at full face, and the face value of what was on his floor was somewhere north of $90 million. That was the business. That was the entire business, and it was legal in every state of the Union, and there was not one thing in those boxes that a prosecutor could have charged him with. On Wednesday, he stopped reading the notes and started reading the money. It was Gio who'd said the thing that started it, 4 days earlier, without knowing what he was saying. He'd said that whoever put the hold on the accounts had known the tax identification numbers off the top of his head, and Roderick had been carrying that around ever since, because a man doesn't memorize those. A man works with them. So he went through the Lakeshore ledgers, with the same patience he'd used on the notes fields, and what he found took him until Friday. Every quarter, the recovery company moved a portion of what it collected into a servicing account, ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of internal transfer that exists in every business in America. And out of that servicing account, over 11 months, money had gone out to 3 vendors, a collection software licensor in Schaumburg, a record storage firm, a skip tracing subcontractor. All 3 of them invoiced properly, on time, at reasonable rates, and all 3 of them had been added as approved vendors in the same week, and all 3 had bank routing that terminated in the same institution in Nevada. He called Gio in and gave him the 3 names, and told him not to use anybody in the office. It took Gio 4 days. He came back on a Tuesday night and stood in the study and didn't sit down. All 3 are shells, Gio said. The software company's got a suite number in a mailbox store. The records firm has never stored a record. The registered agent is the same lawyer for all 3, and he's a lawyer in Reno who does nothing but paper. Rod, the ownership documents are sealed, but the incorporation fees on all 3 were paid out of the same account, and I pulled the wire that funded that account 11 months ago. And it came out of the Halstead closing. Roderick sat very still. Marcus handled the Halstead closing. Marcus handled the Halstead closing. Gio's voice was flat. It's about $3.5 million over 11 months. It's still running. There was a payment out of the servicing account 9 days ago, and Roderick looked down at the boxes still stacked around his study floor, 60,000 of them, the school teacher in Peoria, and the man in Danville, and the notes fields with the crying in them, and he understood something that he'd been circling for a week without letting himself land on it. The money that Marcus Hale had been quietly bleeding out of this family for 11 months had come from the same pipe. It hadn't come out of the freight yards or the linen contracts. It had come out of the collection company. Every dollar the trader had taken had been squeezed out of somebody in a shoebox at a kitchen table, and the reason Marcus had chosen that pipe and not any other one was simple, and Roderick understood it completely, and it was the worst thing he'd understood in 20 years. Marcus had chosen it because it was the one part of the business Roderick never looked at. He'd built a room in his own house and never gone into it, and a man had lived in that room for a year. "Sir," Gio said, after a while. "What do you want to do?" Roderick didn't answer right away. He was looking at a folder that had come open on the floor by his foot. Some woman in Kankakee, $6,000, and a note in the field that said, "Calls at night. Asks us not to call her at work." "Get the lawyers back here," he said. "Not for the boxes. I want to know what it takes to unwind all of it." The lawyers came on a Thursday and were in the study until 9 that night, and it was the wrong question asked in a room with a window, and somebody in that room made a telephone call. Marcus Hale had 11 months of stolen money and a lawyer in Reno, and every reason on earth to believe he had until the fall. What he could not survive was a man unwinding a company from the inside, because unwinding meant an audit, and an audit meant 3 vendors that had never delivered anything. He moved on Saturday. It started at 6:10 in the morning with the accounts. By 7 there was nothing left in any of them. Not the operating account, not the construction companies, not the personal one. All of it swept out through instruments that Marcus himself had spent 4 years being authorized to sign. At 7:20, the linen contracts went. At 7:30, the man who ran the produce routes stopped answering. And then the 2 brothers on the north end stopped answering. And then a capo, who'd been at Roderick's mother's funeral, stopped answering. And it went like that, one after another, the phone ringing out into rooms where men were standing right beside it and had decided not to pick it up. Roderick sat in the study and took the calls that came and made the ones that didn't. He didn't raise his voice on any of them. At 10 minutes past 8, the phone rang, and it was Gio, and Gio's voice wasn't right. He said he'd gone to the Elmwood Park office at 7 to pull the last of the vendor files, and there'd been 4 men waiting inside it. And he said, "Rod, I'm all right. I got out. I'm at Loyola, and they're taking me back in a minute." And Roderick said, "Stop talking." And Gio said, "The files are gone. They took the box." And then he said, "Rod, they knew I was coming." And then somebody took the phone away from him. Roderick sat with the receiver in his hand for a while after the line went dead. He could still have done it. That was the thing that people afterward would never understand about that morning. There were men in 3 counties who would have come if he'd called them. Men who owed him their houses and their sons' educations, and in 2 cases their lives. And if he'd picked up that phone and started dialing, by Sunday night there would have been a war in this city that the newspapers would have been writing about for 10 years, and he'd have won it. He knew he'd have won it. He sat in the chair and thought about what winning would cost. It would cost the 18 months. It would cost every clean thing he'd spent 6 years building. Because you can't fight that kind of war with a construction company. You fight it with the old machinery, and the moment he switched the old machinery back on, that was what he'd be for the rest of his life. It would cost the boxes on the floor. And there was a woman on Lexington Avenue who'd stood in his back hall and told him exactly what he was, and had been right. And if he answered this the way 20 years of his life had trained him to answer it, then everything she'd said about him would be true forever, and there'd be no version of him left that could ever prove otherwise. He put the phone down. At 11:15, he went upstairs and put on his coat. He took nothing with him. Not the watch, not the ring, not the piece in the drawer, not $1, because there wasn't $1 to take. He walked down the front hall of a house he'd bought outright in cash 11 years earlier, and he went out through the gate at the end of the drive, and he pulled it shut behind him and heard the latch, and then he stood on the sidewalk in River Forest at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning, with his hands in his pockets and nowhere in the world to be. He walked to the train. He rode it in with 2 boys with fishing poles and a woman doing a crossword, and nobody looked at him twice. And it occurred to him somewhere around Oak Park that this was the 2nd time in his life he'd been on a public street with empty pockets and no name, and that both times had been within 6 weeks of each other. He got off downtown and walked. He walked a long way, past buildings he owned pieces of and buildings he'd once been told to stay away from. And by the time the light started going, he was on Taylor Street. He stood outside the pharmacy on the corner for a minute. Then he went 2 doors down and into the vestibule of the old brick 3 flat beside it. And he found the name on the 2nd bell, because Gio had brought him that name and that address 5 weeks ago on a morning in April, and he'd never once had to look at the piece of paper again. He pressed the bell. It took a long time. Then the inner door opened, and Ruth Delaney stood there in a housecoat with the chain still on, looking out at a man on her doorstep with no coat collar turned up, and no car at the curb, and nothing in his hands at all. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took the chain off. "Carmela's boy," she said. "Come inside before you catch your death." She put him at the kitchen table and heated soup, and set it down in front of him, and didn't ask him a single question about why he'd come, which he understood later was a kindness of a very particular kind. He ate it. He hadn't eaten anything since Friday, and he hadn't known that until the bowl was in front of him. She sat down across from him with her hands folded and watched him eat the way women of that generation watch people eat, and when he was finished, she took the bowl to the sink and came back and sat down again. "You've been coming to that cemetery for 18 years, she said. "I know because I go the 2nd Sunday, and you go on the day, and 1 year I saw the car. You never said anything. It wasn't mine to say." She smoothed the oilcloth with the flat of her hand. "I worked 21 years with your mother on that floor. She trained me. I was 36 and she was 24 and she trained me. I don't remember much about the diner. You wouldn't. She kept you out of it." Ruth was quiet a moment. "You want me to tell you the truth about her, or the nice version? Because I've got both and I've never given either one to anybody." "The truth." So she told him. She said Carmela had walked out on Enzo Moretti in the fall of the year the boy turned 7, with 2 paper bags and a child, and never went back. Not once. Not for a single night. Not when the heat went out on Aberdeen in January. She said the checks came the first week of every month for 11 years, and Carmela signed every one of them across the back and put them in the mail going the other direction and never opened a single one, and that she had watched her do it at that very table more times than she could count. She said Carmela worked doubles, and picked up other people's shifts and took the holidays because holidays paid more, and that she'd been on that floor the day her boy was born and back on it 11 days later. Then Ruth stopped and looked at her hands and started again. She had a bad heart. She knew it from the time she was about 38. There was a pill she was supposed to take every day, and it was a lot of money then, and she didn't have any insurance, because waitresses didn't. Ruth said it plainly, without any weight on it at all, so she cut them. She had a little cutter from the drugstore, and every night she'd sit right there where you're sitting and she'd cut them in half, and she'd take the half, to make the bottle last twice as long. Roderick didn't move. I said something about it once. Only once, because she had a way of ending a conversation. Ruth's mouth went thin. She said she'd manage. She said the doctor was being cautious, and that was the end of it, and I never brought it up again, and I've had 30 years to think about that, and I think about it all the time. The refrigerator came on somewhere behind her and ran and shut off. She was 44, Ruth said. You were 19. It was 2 years after you went to your father. 2 years and 4 months. Yes. Ruth nodded slowly. She never said one word against you for going. Not to me, not to anybody. But I'll tell you what she did say. Because you're a grown man sitting at my table with no coat on, and I think you came here to hear it. She looked at him steadily. She said, Ruth, I'd rather be poor than be bought. She said it 100 times over 21 years. It's the only thing that woman ever preached at anybody. And Roderick Moretti sat in a kitchen on Taylor Street and understood, all at once and completely, what he had been doing for 18 years. Every April, one morning out of 365, he took off the watch and the ring and the name, and he walked to a corner, and he found somebody at a counter who was $47 short, and he covered it, and he emptied his pockets into their hands and left before they could thank him. And for 1 hour a year, that made him a certain kind of man. And every year after that hour, he'd gone back and put the ring on. He'd built a company that bought 60,000 of those same counters at a few cents on the dollar, and worked them for full face, and put orders through the daily center that came off the top of people's checks before they ever saw the money. He'd been paying for 1 bottle of heart medicine a year with the profits from taking the bottle away from everybody else. His mother had sat at a table like this one, with a little plastic cutter, and split her pills in half so the bottle would last. And she'd done it for 6 years. And she died at 44, and there had been a man across town the entire time who mailed a check the first week of every month that would have covered every one of those bottles for the rest of her life. She had sent them all back. She had chosen the cutter over the check, every single month, for 11 years. And her son had grown up to become the check. He put his hand over his eyes and held it there. He didn't make any sound at all. Ruth Delaney got up and went to the stove and stood with her back to him and put the kettle on that neither of them wanted, and she left him alone with it for as long as he needed, which is what you do, and which she had learned from his mother. He stayed at Ruth's 4 nights, and on the 5th morning he used her telephone and called the Chicago field office and asked for Helen Whitmore by name, and he told her where he'd be at 2 o'clock and that he'd be alone. She came with 2 other agents and left them in the car. They sat in a booth in a coffee shop on Roosevelt Road, and he put a canvas bag on the seat beside him and didn't open it right away. You understand? I have to say certain things to you first, she said. Say them. So she said them, the warnings, the whole formula, and he listened to all of it without interrupting, and then he said, I'm not here for a deal. Everybody says that. I'm not going to argue with you about it. He put the bag on the table. 20 years. Ledgers going back to when I was 26. Account numbers, the men, the arrangements, the 2 aldermen, the freight yards, all of it. It's not a sample, and I'm not holding anything back to trade later. Whitmore didn't touch the bag. Why? That isn't your business. It's exactly my business. Then you'll have to live without it, he said. I want 2 things, and neither of them is for me. There's a woman named Vivian Quinn on Lexington Avenue, and her father's at a facility in Cicero, and I want both of them looked after, formally, on paper, from the day I sign anything. And when you take the companies apart, I want Lakeshore Recovery Partners done first. Before the construction company, before any of it. That portfolio comes down before anything else does. You're asking me to prioritize a consumer debt firm over a racketeering case. I'm telling you what I'll sign for. Whitmore sat back and looked at him for a long moment. You know what you're doing to yourself. Say it out loud anyway. You'll go to prison, she said. You're not walking out of this. Cooperation of this size. On a case like this, in front of a federal judge in this district. You're still going to do years, and I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and tell you otherwise. All right, that's it? All right? That's it. She let the moment sit. Then she said, I want to give you something. It's not a courtesy. It's because if you find it out later, you'll think I ran you. She folded her hands. 9 months ago, somebody came to me. Not through a lawyer, no proffer, just a voice on a telephone. He gave me the freight yards, and he gave me 2 dates, and he gave me your movements down to the hour, and he's called me 11 times since. Roderick didn't move. I never met him, and he never used a name, but he knew things about your calendar that 4 people on this earth know. Marcus Hale. Roderick said, I didn't tell you that. You didn't have to. He looked out the window at Roosevelt Road for a while. He'd been in that coffee shop as a boy, so he was going to take it all, and then hand me to you afterward, and stand in a courtroom looking sorry. That was my read on it, yes. Then he'll be very disappointed, Roderick said, because I got here first. He signed that afternoon. He signed 9 documents in a federal building, with a lawyer beside him, who told him twice not to. And afterward, he sat in a room with 3 agents and started talking, and he talked for 11 hours that day, and 11 the next. It was on the 4th night, at 20 past midnight, that Whitmore's phone rang, and it was one of the agents assigned to Cicero. A private medical transport van had pulled into the loading bay at 11:50 with an authorized transfer order for Thomas Quinn, signed and faxed, naming a receiving facility downstate in Vermilion County that had no bed in his name and no record of the referral. The paperwork was correct. The van was licensed. The 2 men in it had valid credentials. The facility's overnight administrator had signed the release at 8 minutes past midnight, and the patient was already loaded. Roderick was standing in a hallway with a coffee cup in his hand when they told him. He set the cup down on a window ledge and said, That's not a kidnapping. That's a transfer he's got standing to sign because his firm bought the servicing rights on that account 4 days ago. He wants me to come get him. He wants me on a road at 1 in the morning doing something he can point at. Then what do you want us to do? Nothing on the road, Roderick said. Call the state licensing board's after-hours line and have them pull the transport company's certificate tonight, and call the receiving facility and get it on a recorded line that they've got no bed. The van's committed the moment it crosses a county line with a patient and no destination. So they did it with telephones. It took 40 minutes, and it happened entirely in an office with fluorescent lights, and the van was stopped by a state trooper on Interstate 57 near Kankakee for operating without a valid certificate, and Thomas Quinn was brought back to Cicero at 4 in the morning, asleep the entire time, and never knew that any of it had happened. Marcus Hale was arrested 6 days later at O'Hare with a boarding pass to Reno. There were no shots fired. There was no chase. 2 agents stood up from a bench near his gate and showed him a warrant, and the whole thing took less than a minute. And the paper in the warrant had come out of a canvas bag on a coffee shop table. The unwinding took 5 months, and he was in custody for most of it. And the lawyers came to a federal detention center on Van Buren with folders, and he signed what needed signing. Lakeshore Recovery Partners was dissolved. The portfolio wasn't sold, because selling it would only have handed 60,000 people to somebody else. So it went instead to a non-profit medical debt relief organization that buys paper and destroys it, and that structure mattered for a reason no one in the room got sentimental about, which is that a forgiven debt is taxable income in this country, and a debt abolished by a charity is not. So it went that way. 60,000 files. $90-some million in face value, gone in a single afternoon in a conference room with nobody in it but attorneys. The letters went out in September, and they were 1 page, and they said the account had been permanently discharged and no further payment would ever be sought, and there was no name at the bottom of them, no company, no benefactor, nothing to thank. A woman in Kankakee opened hers standing at her mailbox and had to sit down on the porch step. A retired schoolteacher in Peoria read hers 3 times and then called her daughter. And on Lexington Avenue in Chicago, a shoebox with 14 envelopes in it got a 15th. And the woman who put it there sat at her kitchen table for a long while afterward and didn't tell anybody. The sentencing was in March. The government's letter to the court was 11 pages, and the judge said from the bench that in 19 years he had never received one like it. 60 months, federal, no parole in the federal system, the credit for good conduct and nothing else. Roderick Moretti stood up and said nothing at all, because he'd been offered the chance to speak and had declined it. And when they turned him to take him out, he looked back at the gallery exactly once. She was in the 3rd row. She'd taken the morning off work and she was sitting with her hands in her lap, and pinned to the collar of her coat was a cream-colored plastic name tag with blue script across the top and a hairline crack running up through the pinback, and the letters punched into it one at a time on a machine that didn't exist anymore. He looked at it. Then they took him through the door. 4 years and 3 months later, on a cold, bright morning in June, the gate at a federal facility outside Terre Haute opened, and a man came out of it carrying a paper bag with his own belongings in it. There was no car. He walked to the road and took a bus, and then another bus, and it was a little after 1 in the afternoon when he came up out of the ground on the Blue Line and walked east on Taylor Street with the bag under his arm. The pharmacy on the corner was still there. 2 doors down, the sign over the Bluebird had been repainted, the same blue, brighter. Inside, the chairs were down, and the lunch was going, and the photographs were still up on the wall by the register. And there was a new one at the end of the row now, of a 65-year-old man in an apron on his last day, laughing at whoever was holding the camera. Dominic Rossi had sold it to her on contract, 5 years, monthly, at a fair price and not $1 under, because he'd told her that if he gave it to her, she'd never be able to say the word mine about it, and she'd agreed with him. She'd been able to make those payments because the judgment against her had been vacated the same week the portfolio was destroyed, and the order that had been taking 15% off the top of her checks had stopped, and she had kept every dollar she earned for 4 years, which no one had ever done for her, and which she had done for herself. Roderick came in, and the bell went, and nobody in the place looked up. He crossed to the corner booth by the window and sat down at table 6 and set the paper bag on the seat beside him. He didn't pick up the menu. He heard the kitchen door swing, and he didn't turn around, and a few minutes later, a plate came down in front of him, and it was a meatball sandwich, and beside it a bowl of minestrone, and neither of them had been ordered. He looked up. Vivian Quinn was standing there with the towel over her shoulder, 32 years old, in her own dining room, and she didn't say anything, and neither did he. He ate all of it. It took him a while. When he was finished, he took out a plain envelope from the paper bag, and out of the envelope he counted the bills onto the table, one at a time, the way somebody had once counted them onto a counter 8 feet from where he was sitting, and it was cash, and it covered it, and there was nothing else in the envelope afterward. She came back over and looked at the money on the table. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. So here is what that story is really about. Kindness isn't measured by what it costs the person giving it. It's measured by whether the person receiving it gets to keep their dignity, which is why a job offered honestly is worth more than a check handed down. 1 good hour a year can never cancel out the harm we allow ourselves not to look at. And the room in our own house that we refuse to walk into is usually the room where the damage is being done. A person isn't finally measured by what they've done, but by what they're willing to pay to put it right. And the kindness we give away when we have everything has a way of coming back to us on the day we have nothing at all. If this story moved you, please give it a like so more people can find it, and share it with someone who could use it today. And subscribe to our channel for a new story like this one every day. Now, we'd love to hear from you, so tell us in the comments what this story made you feel, and whether you've ever seen a small act of kindness come back around in your own life, because we read every single one, and there is real wisdom in what you send us. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we wish you good health, peace, and joy in the days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.